Today on the FFD YouTube channel, we take you through everything you need to know before your Dynasty Startup Draft. And as a bonus, we've got plenty of tips you probably never thought of for established Dynasty leaguers. Let's create a dynasty together on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe. You can also check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down and on Twitter at Fantasy First Down. We answer all your questions over there. If you want my Dynasty rankings, you can also head over to ffdfantasyfootball.com, and I've got heaps of Dynasty articles over at football.rasball.com. Today we're talking Dynasty leagues, and whether you're a novice or a Dynasty veteran, we got heaps of tips for you that you've probably never thought of. We're going to go through everything you need to consider before your Dynasty startup, plus heaps of advice for those of you who already have established Dynasty leagues. Let's get into it. Now, there's a lot of things that you need to consider when you're starting a Dynasty team. The first thing starts with the draft, of course. Where are you going to draft from? Do you have that option? What sort of team do you want to build? Do you want them to be young, or do you want them to be established, challenging straight away? You need to consider your league settings. You need to consider what you want your roster to look like. Who are you picking early? Who are you targeting late? And what are you going to do with your future picks? We're going to talk through all of those things right now. Let's start off with the most important thing. Where are you drafting from in your Dynasty League? Now, in some situations, you have absolutely no choice. You just have to draft wherever you start. However, there are plenty of situations where you either choose your starting position based on some sort of competition, or alternatively, you can trade starting positions with other people. Generally, in a redraft league, statistics show that drafting earlier is an advantage because there's so much difference between the first couple of picks and every other pick after that. That's not so much the case in dynasty leagues, and especially not in superflex dynasty leagues. You get a lot more spread in the value of players, and obviously your team is going to need to be a whole lot deeper. So those later picks make more difference, meaning picking earlier is less of an advantage. Now, why would you care where you're going to pick, given ultimately all of those picks are going to have similar value? You're still going to average 11 picks between every single one of your picks. Well, you want to take advantage of value. In every single draft of every type, players are going to fall from their ideal dynasty drafting position. So consider that every player has a slot they should go in. Sometimes they're going to go earlier. In fact, most of the times they're going to be drafted either earlier or later. You want to be able to take advantage of players falling. So let's have a look at how that works. I've basically done up a chart and said, well, essentially, every player has a chance of falling. If they fall 1 pick, 2 picks, or all the way up to 12 picks, ultimately, you have a chance of catching them in their fall. What position do you want to be in order to catch them? Well, you want to be in the middle of the round. If you're in the middle of the round, you have nearly twice as much chance of catching a falling player as you do on the ends. That's because every single one of your picks is occurring every 12 to 14 picks, whereas on the ends, sometimes you have to wait 22 picks and you miss on the falling player, and then your other pick happens directly before your previous pick, and you can only get value with that second pick if 2 players have fallen, and that's significantly less likely. So you're definitely going to get less value with that second pick. I do realize, by the way, that this is a very how you doing sort of mathematical concept here. I'm kind of making a few assumptions here with it, which aren't quite accurate, but it certainly gives you an idea of roughly what to expect. That average, by the way, makes absolutely no difference. Just kind of gives you an idea of how much better it is to be picking in the middle than the end. So hopefully that encourages you to try to take those 6th to 7th, 8th, even 5th to 8th picks in your dynasty drafts if you have that choice, because you're going to get so much value in the middle rounds. Now, are there exceptions to this? Well, yeah. If there are specific players you're targeting with your first few picks, if you know in your dynasty draft, I must come out of my draft with CD Lamb or Justin Jefferson because I want one of those guys on my team. I love my team more when I have an absolute stud wide receiver. Well, of course, you can pick earlier and build your team around that guy. But if your goal is to win, and it is for most of us, then realistically, you need to be drafting in those middle picks. You can maximize the value you're getting with every pick. Now, the next decision you need to make, and you probably can't make this until you're a couple of picks in, is what is your team going to look like? In Dynasty football, there are team life stages, and every team should be somewhere in one of these life stages. If you're not in one of these life stages, you're not playing Dynasty properly. Now, a lot of people think Dynasty and they think, I'm going for a rebuild. I'm going to take a rubbish team. I'm going to turn it into a league winner. And that is arguably one of the most fun things to do in Dynasty. If you're going to do a full rebuild, even to start with, you need to go into the league knowing that that's what you're going to do and everything needs to be built around that thing. So you'll know within a couple of picks that you're probably headed for a rebuild because your first few startup picks are going to be young players that might need a year or two before they get good, and you're going to be taking a lot of risks on youngsters. So if your first few picks, relatively young guys or guys that aren't going to be good immediately, you're probably headed for a rebuild straight off the bat. What does that mean? Well, firstly, you have to fully commit to that rebuild. If you decide to take young guys with your first 4 or 5 picks, and then you decide that you're going to draft veteran running backs, you're screwing up your team. Those guys aren't going to still be playing at a high level when your young guys become good. You're basically ensuring that your team is going to be weak long term. You're essentially doing an Atlanta Falcons. You've brought in a whole heap of win now guys, and then you've used an early draft pick to select a guy who can't help you immediately. You don't want to do that on fantasy. So commit to the rebuild, whether it's a startup or an established team. If you've decided you're going to do a rebuild, you have to do it properly. If you have existing assets, sell all of those existing assets and try to secure young quarterbacks and young pass catchers. You don't want to get running backs yet. Running backs come when you're about to challenge because their lifespan is so short. There's no point in drafting them now before you know that you're going to be good. You also want to acquire as many draft picks as possible. So if you know that you're going to be doing a rebuild during this sort of draft, ideally, you want to be taking your startup picks and instead trading them for good, high-value rookie picks. You want to be trying to get first rounders or second rounders down the track, or in this year's rookie draft, if your draft is broken up like that. So you need to go into it attempting to get rid of those assets that are going to help you now for more valuable assets in the future because you're willing to wait for them when a lot of other teams aren't. You should also make sure if you're doing a full rebuild that especially your bench, but essentially your whole roster needs to have a heap of upside. There is no point in drafting a guy who is just going to be a bench filler. You don't need Tyler Boyd or the equivalent of that. You need a guy like Quinton Johnston, who's probably going to bust, but realistically, if he hits, he could be very good for your team. So you need guys who are going to be future stars, or at least future top 24 players if everything goes right for them. You should also make sure that if you're doing this, you've got to lose every single game until you're ready to challenge. You need those early draft picks. You need to be making your team as weak as possible on actual league days to make sure that you can essentially tank to get those early draft picks. And that means you don't want to trade away rookie picks. You only want to trade away startup draft picks. Now, let's say you want to go young, but you don't actually want to do a full rebuild. You just want to have a team that's young, but still a good team. And that's a very possible thing to do in a dynasty startup, but you have to be pretty darn good to make it work. So it's possible that you go through the first few rounds and you find yourself just getting quite a few young players. Maybe it's a super flex league and you drafted Caleb Williams and Brock Bowers and Marvin Harrison Jr. and those guys. So your team is good and ready to win now, but it's also very young. If you're in that sort of situation, then you need to walk a very fine line. You're ready to challenge for titles, so you want to make sure that you've got good players. But as soon as you're not in the top couple of teams in a given year, you probably want to be selling your oldest assets and trying to get in the best young players. You need to be constantly bringing in quality young players. And as soon as you miss on a season or two with your young players, you're essentially going to be forced into a rebuild or having to buy up and hit all-in mode. So it's very hard to walk this fine line. Some very good dynasty players are able to keep winning over and over by understanding when they need to sell their aging assets. So if you're young but strong, you need to stay young, or you need to decide that you're going to move into all-in mode. When I'm in this sort of situation, I will generally try to trade my future picks for picks for the coming year. So basically, as soon as the off season hits, and many of you won't have had your rookie drafts yet, and if that's you and you're in this sort of situation, you want to be taking your 2025 picks and trading it for 2024 picks. And if you're in a dynasty draft like this, you probably want as many young, high rookie picks and a lot of good young players in your startup. You basically need to focus on youth and constantly recycling to keep your team relatively young. You don't want players that are close to falling off. Now, my favorite mode in Dynasty, and this is what I go into a lot of Dynasty drafts deciding, is that I'm just going to go into all-in mode immediately. Realistically, we play fantasy football to win, and I enjoy going into a Dynasty draft and just treating it like a redraft draft. I'm going to win for the next season or two, and I don't care what happens down the track. If I need to hit a rebuild, I'll hit a rebuild, but right now I'm here to win. Sell all your future picks and pick up aging veterans that only have a couple of years left that are still good. Go out and get Christian McCaffrey. Go out and get Mike Evans, get Amari Cooper, get Travis Kelce, get guys that you know only have a couple of years left in them, but they're going to be very good for a couple of years. When you do that, you really want to make sure that you're taking advantages of guys who are trying to rebuild and trying to get those guys cheaper by trading away your future picks. That can be pretty hard to do because people won't value your picks much. They know that your team is good, and they'll want to make sure that they're taking advantage of that. So ideally, you want to trade those picks away in the original Dynasty startup before it even starts. If you can take your rookie picks, trade them away and get some early draft Dynasty startup picks, then that's going to really help you out because you're going to start off with a really good Dynasty team. You also need to make sure that you're really focused on having a strong starting lineup. You don't really need depth. Depth is not going to help you. Your goal is to go all in and win. There's no point in going semi all in, but making sure I have a pretty solid bench just in case something happens. No, just make sure your starting lineup is elite. At every stage, you want to be making sure you're upgrading your starting players. The moment you can't win, the moment you've gone over the hill and you're starting to age out and you're realizing there's better teams, that's where you need to transition back to full rebuild and do a rebuild. Okay, so when you're going into your dynasty startups, you don't need to decide immediately what you're doing, but within 4 or 5 picks, it should be immediately obvious based on the players you've picked, whether you're going full rebuild, whether you're going young but strong, or whether you're going all in. If you're not fitting into one of these categories, then you need to be rethinking your strategy and picking one and then sticking to it for the rest of the startup. The biggest position to think of when making this decision is running backs. Running backs are very different in every one of these categories. In a full rebuild, in a dynasty startup where I'm going to start in rebuild mode, I wouldn't be drafting running backs at all. I'd be waiting till very late in the draft and then picking up a whole heap of young upside running backs, handcuffs, guys like Braylon Allen and Ray Davis and people like that who are going to get into a starting job if someone gets injured or the veteran moves on. But realistically, they're probably not going to turn into anything. That not only helps me tank, but it also makes sure that I've got cheap upside players on my bench. If you're young but strong, then you can go for guys like a Jahmyr Gibbs. But you want to make sure all of your running backs are kind of in their early 20s, in their prime. If you go in all-in mode, get a heap of running backs early on. Okay, this is where you want your Christian McCaffreys, your best players who are going to win that league for you immediately. Now let's talk about how we actually value positions relative to each other. This is a chart that's courtesy of Ian Hartix, who does a very good job on this sort of thing. He basically looked through and he looked at each position and found out what ages the top 12 players in fantasy were. Now, personally, if I was doing this, I probably would have looked a little bit lower for running backs and wide receivers, but I think the general idea still holds. Basically, quarterbacks are going to be good at every age. Now, the fact that he's bundled 35 plus together makes it look like they're amazing when they're older. That's just because you've got a whole heap of ages crunched together. But essentially, it should be telling you that quarterbacks can be good at any age. Why is there that little bundle at the top? Well, that's because run-heavy quarterbacks are generally good in their mid-20s. Then you'll get the pass-heavy quarterbacks becoming better later on. So when you go through and do this sort of situation, when you're starting up your dynasty league, you need to understand what sort of quarterback you're getting and how you should value them. For example, a Lamar Jackson or a Jalen Hurts is very valuable for a win now team, but ultimately they're more likely to be one of those guys that falls off as they get older. Whereas a Patrick Mahomes is going to be good for the long term. You'll expect he's going to be good well into his later 30s. So there are different values even within QBs, but as a general rule, QBs hold their value for a lot longer. And that makes them very valuable in Dynasty with one exception. That one exception is if you're going all in, you really don't care about your quarterback too much, there is going to be a good, cheap quarterback like a Kirk Cousins or someone like that who's going to give you top 12 numbers, but only for the next year or two. So you can do that when you're all in. But if you're trying to think for the future, then you want to be making sure that you're getting QBs pretty early and valuing them very high. You'll also know that running backs have a real fall off when they hit about 28. It's very unusual to have a good running back that keeps playing well after that. So because running backs have such a short lifespan, that means they have significantly less value in Dynasty. You want your wide receivers because they're going to be good even when they're older. And what you can't see in this chart, because it's only top 12, is that wide receivers, when they're in the top 24, will last a lot longer. Running backs will just fall off altogether. Wide receivers will stay solid well into their 30s. And that means that you can afford to value them and use them for the longer term. The same thing happens with tight ends. Tight ends last a lot longer. We're seeing that with Travis Kelce at the moment. While tight ends are best in their late 20s, you can still get value from them in the long term. That means that running backs have a lot less value in Dynasty. There's also another number of other reasons for that as well. Running backs have less job security. It's very easy to go and get another running back. We see how cheap running back second contracts seem to be. That's why they're constantly holding out, because it's very unusual for them to get a good contract because they're so replaceable. And that gives them less dynasty value. They also miss more games. They miss 50% more games than wide receivers and tight ends. That's courtesy of ProFootballLogic.com. Whereas QBs miss even less games than wide receivers and tight ends. So obviously that means that there's less value in spending up on a running back who might be injured, who might lose his job, and who's got a smaller lifespan. Unless your goal is to win immediately, you're better off going for your wide receivers and tight ends in your startup draft, and then you can get good young running backs either in the rookie draft, though not this year's because rookie running backs are weak this year. You can trade for them when you're ready to win, or you can get them in later rounds and just wait for those injuries. It's so easy to get good running backs later on. It's a whole lot harder to get high quality wide receivers. So you want to get a whole heap of high quality wide receivers early in your drafts. Also related to this is your scoring settings. So this will affect how you value each of those positions. Does your league have 4-point or 6-point passing touchdowns? Potentially it's got 5-point as well. How are quarterbacks' values? Do quarterbacks, for some reason, get less points per yard than most quarterback leagues? Are there some weird things that affect how quarterbacks are going to be valued? If you've got 6-point passing touchdowns, that's going to affect a couple of things. Firstly, all quarterbacks are going to increase in value because they're going to get more points relative to every other position. That means the spread between quarterbacks is going to be higher, and that means that having a good starting quarterback is going to be beneficial. Additionally, quarterbacks who throw for a lot of touchdowns increase in value. That's going to bump Patrick Mahomes. That's going to bump CJ Stroud. That's going to bump potentially someone like a Caleb Williams, Joe Burrow, Tua Tagovailoa, guys that aren't going to be doing a lot of running, but they are going to give you benefits based on how many touchdowns they're going to throw. Whereas someone like a Josh Allen or a Lamar Jackson or a Jalen Hurts, who gets a lot of their touchdowns on the ground, is going to decrease in value relative to the other quarterbacks in their cohort. The other quarterbacks are going to jump them, but every quarterback is still going to move up relative to the other positions. The reception scoring also makes a massive difference. These days, nearly every dynasty league is PPR. It's pretty unusual to have a non-PPR dynasty league. It does happen, but it is certainly less likely these days. I know there's still a fair bit of half PPR, mainly in redraft, but dynasty is usually PPR as the standard these days. That does a couple of things. Firstly, in a PPR league, wide receivers get a big boost because they get a whole lot more receptions. That means that wide receivers, who we already talked about are more valuable because of their long lifespan, suddenly become significantly more valuable as well because they're getting points for their receptions. That's also going to impact how you value tight ends and running backs and which tight ends and running backs you value. Tight ends get a slight boost because they're also getting a fair few receptions, but they also get a lot of their points from touchdowns. So all of a sudden, those touchdowns are less valuable relative to the number of receptions they're getting. So you want to dial back those tight ends who are very touchdown hungry, guys like Jake Ferguson and people like that, who are going to get a fair few red zone looks and going to get a lot of their points that way. And you want a whole lot more value out of those check down tight ends, the guys like Trey McBride and people like that, who are going to get a lot of receptions. Evan Ingram, for example, are going to get a lot of receptions, but less touchdowns. And also, guys like Mark Andrews, who get a lot of points through yards, are also less valuable in this situation because the receptions are making such a big difference relatively. Running backs also get affected as well. We know that there are some running backs who just rarely get receptions. They're mainly rushing running backs. Whereas there are a whole heap of receiving running backs, they all get a big boost in PPR. PPR brings in guys like your Naheem Hines and Tyreek Cohen's and people like that who in the past, James White's of the past, who have been top 20 running backs based purely on receptions. There's not a whole lot of those in the league at the moment, but there are certainly running backs that are going to get more receptions than others. On the other hand, pure rushers like Zamir White and people like that, who are mostly going to do their damage on the ground, become less valuable in PPR because they're not getting that PPR boost. So you've got to understand how the players are valued relative to each other based on your league settings. Pretty much all dynasty settings out there will be for PPR. So it's most important if you're in a non-PPR or a half PPR league that you increase the value of those guys that are getting less receptions or more touchdowns. That means they're suddenly going to become significantly more valuable in your league. And it's also going to boost running backs relative to the other positions because they get less PPR points based on compared to the other positions. They're going to get that boost from it being a non-PPR or half PPR league. Also, in a non-PPR league or half PPR league, suddenly quarterbacks become far more valuable because they're getting more points. They're not affected by how many points or receptions having. So if all the other positions are getting less points based on receptions, all of a sudden quarterbacks become significantly more valuable as well. Tight end premium is another one to consider. Obviously, if you're in a tight end premium league, all of your tight ends get a little bit of a boost, but especially receiving tight ends, guys like your Evan Ingrams and Trey McBrides that I talked about earlier, guys that get high reception totals get a really big boost from tight end premiums. Does your league have bonus points? A lot of leagues will have points if a player goes over 100 yards or over 200 yards in a game. If a quarterback throws for over 400 or 500 yards, maybe they rip off a big 40 or 50-yard play and they get bonus points for that. That encourages you to draft those more boom bust players who are going to have those big weeks, and certainly to value those guys who are going to have those big weeks relative to other players. Who that is depends on the settings in your league. So you have to really understand your settings and what that means. Also, there's big play ones. There are some leagues that give massive bonuses for big plays. They'll give you another 6 or 7 points if someone rips off 50-yard plays. All of a sudden, someone like Gabe Davis or something like that, who's known for those big long touchdowns. Wide receivers are going to take the lid off the defense, that are going to go deep and make really long plays. That's the sort of player that you suddenly want in your team, as opposed to those check down players who are going to get a lot of PPR yards. So it just gives them a small boost and means they might be worth rostering and using when they wouldn't be otherwise. Obviously, if your league is best ball, that makes a massive difference to all of these things as well. I'm not going to talk about best ball too much. Firstly, because best ball dynasty is still a pretty niche thing. And secondly, because it has such a big impact that it'll take too long to go through everything. The last thing to consider, do you have IDP, kicker, and DST, and what are their settings? IDP makes a big difference, but if you're interested in IDP, you want to go and watch my previous video where I talked a whole heap about IDP and the impact of different IDP settings. If you've still got a kicker, firstly, I'm sorry to hear that. Secondly, don't value them very high unless they're getting like 50 points or something like that. The difference between kickers is very small, and you're better off just streaming them. I've got a separate video up talking about the benefits of streaming kickers in DST. It is a whole lot harder to stream DST in Dynasty because a lot more people will hold multiple DSTs on their bench, meaning that less is available for you. But they're less likely to hold more than 2 kickers. Even if everyone in your league is holding 2 kickers, you should still be streaming kickers. You should be drafting them last round. You should never be picking anyone up in a rookie draft. You should always be taking kickers as late as possible, and you should only ever have one in your roster. Whereas with DSTs, if other people are valuing them quite high, that means you need at least a couple on your bench just to make sure that you've got options available. But ultimately, you should still be cycling and streaming as much as possible, as opposed to holding on to teams for no particular reason. Now, we talked about the point settings, but what about the roster construction? What about the number of each player that you start with? These things will make a big difference to how you value players in your startup draft. The first and biggest thing, is it a Superflex league? Superflex, for those who don't know, is basically where in your league, every team starts 2 quarterbacks or has the option of starting 2 quarterbacks. Obviously, if it's an actual 2 QB league, which are a bit out of fashion at the moment, where you have to start 2 QBs, all of a sudden QBs increase massively in value. But even in a super flex league, because we already talked about how valuable quarterbacks are because of their lifespan, because they score so many more points than other positions, in a super flex league, you just have to get a whole lot of quarterbacks early on. I will generally, in a super flex league, when it's a dynasty, draft quarterbacks first couple of rounds. I'll generally want to come out of the first 4 rounds with 3 quarterbacks or at least 2 very good quarterbacks. So it's either 2 reliable quarterbacks or 3 solid quarterbacks that I feel comfortable starting. Because realistically, quarterbacks are still going to get injured. They're going to have bye weeks. You've got to make sure that you've got quarterbacks that you can start. Plus, you want to be able to take pot shots on quarterbacks later on to make sure that you're able to get enough in. It's also important to understand whether there's a roster limit on how many quarterbacks you're allowed to draft. I've been in a lot of superflex leagues. We're not allowed to draft more than 3 quarterbacks in the original startup draft. That changes how you value them. All of a sudden, those lower quarterbacks decrease in value because you know they're still going to be hanging around late on in the draft. If you're in a 10-team league and everyone's allowed to draft at most 3 quarterbacks, don't take your 3rd quarterback until the last round, because the number 30 quarterback isn't that far away from the number 26 or number 27 quarterback. So you can take advantage of these sort of league settings. I would personally, in most situations, even when there's roster limits, still want to have 3 good quarterbacks. The only exception is if I'm doing a full rebuild and I expect that I'll be able to probably get a quarterback early on in the next couple of seasons because the value hasn't fallen to me in the startup draft. I certainly go in with the intention of getting 3 solid quarterbacks, though, in any super flex league. What about flex spots? Well, flex spots are a little bit tricky, but as a general rule, flex spots benefit wide receivers. That's because most dynasty leagues are PPR. In a PPR league, wide receivers are going to be the high scoring position. And the extra players outside your top 12 tight ends, your top 24 to 36 wide receivers, and your top 24 running backs, those next group of players that are scoring the most points are usually wide receivers. In most leagues, flex spots will be filled with wide receivers. Sometimes, if you're really strong at running back, you might start one there. But for the most part, you're probably better off starting a wide receiver. That means you need to massively increase the value of wide receivers the more flex spots you have, because you need more wide receivers on your bench to put into those flex spots, especially after injuries and bye weeks. So wide receivers already have a lot of value in Dynasty. The more flex spots you have, the more they increase in value. Funnily enough, as soon as you add a 3rd wide receiver spot, that essentially takes away a whole heap of guys that would have gone into that flex spot. So you now kind of need a little bit more running back help as well to fix those flex spots. But I would still, if I had 3 wide receiver spots, want a lot of wide receivers, especially if I've got 3 wide receiver spots and 2 flex spots, which I've seen in quite a few dynasty startups. I would be hitting wide receiver constantly. I'd want 7, 8, 9 good wide receivers out of the first 12 to 14 rounds. You need a heap of wide receivers because everyone's going to want them and they're going to be extremely valued. So they're not only useful for you, they're also useful as trade bait to getting other valuable players that you might decide you need. You basically need to be thinking ahead and thinking, What are other players in my league going to be short on, and what are they going to need? It doesn't matter whether you need it now, it matters what's valuable, and you want those guys. It's also really worth considering how many bench spots you have in your league. So, for example, if you only have 6 or 7 or 8 bench spots in a dynasty league, which would be weird, but it does happen, all of a sudden you need to think that every pick is suddenly way less valuable. The waiver wires going to be full of good players. You can choose a whole heap of upside on your bench. You probably only need one quarterback in a one quarterback league because there'll be a heap on waivers. You can suddenly value players very differently. You suddenly want top end players because there's less players on rosters. If you're in a standard dynasty league, you'd hope to have about 10 to 15 bench spots. And in that sort of situation, all of a sudden you can start talking about having backup quarterbacks. In a super flex league, probably having 2 backup quarterbacks, having a backup tight end or 2, depending on how strong you are at tight end. You'd want a heap of upside running backs, guys that are totally useless now, but only need one injury to suddenly be a starter. I'm thinking guys like Braylon Allen. If Breece Hall goes down, Braylon Allen is all of a sudden a league winner for you. Wide receiver, you want some upside guys that need things to go the right way, and suddenly they can be very good. Basically, think to yourself, is this guy on my bench ever going to start for me on merit? Would an injury ahead of him, would a change at quarterback, would natural improvement because he's young mean that suddenly he starts for me in the future? Not because you have a heap of injuries and you're desperate, but because you actually need him to start because he's better than everyone else. If a player's not going to start because of that, there's no point having them on your bench unless you have very shallow benches. Think about someone like a Tyler Boyd. Realistically, if you're starting him on merit, your team sucks and you don't need to be thinking about winning. You probably want to be rebuilding. So what's the point in having him on your bench? You might as well put someone on your bench that could become a top 20 or 30 player if things go right for him. You've got to be thinking that through with your benches. As your benches get deeper, all of a sudden you do need a couple more of those players. If you have a very deep bench, someone like a Tyler Boyd can be valuable because you might get a couple of injuries. There isn't anyone available on waivers that's going to give you any points at all. So you do need a couple of reliable players in every position, maybe 2 wide receivers, 2 running backs, a tight end, and a quarterback who will start and give you enough value in a bye week or if injuries hit you. After that, you still need to fill your bench with upside, mostly running backs and wide receivers, and a few tight ends, and no kickers on your bench, and ideally no DST either. So that's ideally what I'm hoping for my roster construction. That's what I want to come out of a Dynasty Startup Draft with. The next question is, what do I do with my early picks? Well, these early picks are going to dictate what your draft looks like. Your first 3 to 4 picks will tell you what your team's going to be built around. Do you want your team to be young and rebuilding early on? Are you willing to wait a couple of years but have a super team in a couple of years as everything goes right? Do you just want to go in and win now? Are you essentially seeing this as a redraft team where you're just going to win it in the next couple of seasons? Or do you want to have a good, young, strong team because you want to keep winning over and over and over again? Basically, think about that after your first couple of picks. With your first couple of picks, just go for the best value. Take the best player available, and then in 3 or 4 picks, go, okay, all of my players are pretty young, but they probably need a little bit of time to develop. Or, oh, wow, I've got a whole heap of guys that can help me win immediately. As long as your first few picks are all in that same type of shape, you're usually going to be okay and be in a good position to plan around that team for the rest of your draft. I would suggest in a super flex league, as I said, you want 2 or 3 quarterbacks in the first 3 to 4 rounds. Okay, really focus on secure quarterbacks. In a super flex league, for example, someone like an Anthony Richardson really takes a drop for me because I can't rely on him being a starting quarterback in 5 years' time. Whereas in a 1 QB league, I'm happy to take that because he could be the QB1 next year, or he could be totally out of the league. And I'm okay with that because there'll definitely be someone else available for me to pick up. So think about how you value those players based on your scoring settings. In PPR, with my early picks, I definitely want wide receivers. It does not matter what league setting you're in. Even if you're trying to win now, you need wide receivers in the early rounds. So I want a heap of QBs in Superflex, and even in Superflex and definitely in 1 QB leagues, I definitely want a heap of wide receivers. The only situation where I would take a running back in the early rounds is if I either want to be young and strong and I can pick up someone like a Jahmyr Gibbs or a Breece Hall, someone who's only been playing for a year or two, or a rookie, a Bijan would be ideal. That would be fine, but I wouldn't be reaching for them. Or if I'm trying to win now, if I want to be strong now and win immediately, then I'd consider the likes of Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor, guys that are going to be elite straight away and can help me win straight away. And I'm essentially getting a bargain by drafting them later because everyone else is going for young players. In a 1 QB league, there is an argument that you should take QBs later. I was in the CBS Sport mock draft last week, and they talked a lot about how you need to wait until later to take QBs. I don't agree with that at all. QBs are going to be the player that you build your team around. You can get massive value by taking a Patrick Mahomes, a Josh Allen, a Jalen Hurts, someone that is going to be good for the long term and win you your league for a number of years over the next 10 seasons or so. You need to understand that QBs, especially guys that are going to be reliable for the long term, are extraordinarily valuable in Dynasty, even in a 1 QB league. As soon as you're not getting an elite quarterback, then you can start to wait because there is so much depth at the position and there's a whole heap of guys that you can take on. But I do really like the idea of taking one early. And I also love the idea of getting this year's QBs in Caleb Williams and Jaden Daniels. I think there's a lot of value there. Now, what about the late rounds? So hopefully you've been smart in your early rounds. You've got your wide receivers. You might have picked up a QB early on. You've started to get your starting running backs in the middle rounds, or you got them early if you're trying to win now. When now in the late rounds, you'll have filled out your whole starting lineup, and you'll probably have some good starters on your bench as well, guys that you expect to be able to sub in and win immediately. The only exception to that, of course, is if you're in a full rebuild and you're going very young early on. You probably have a heap of young wide receivers and quarterbacks and maybe a few young tight ends. In the late round, well, it is going to depend a little bit on what you're aiming to do. If you're doing a full rebuild, you want a whole heap of young players here. Every player needs to be young. Every player must have massive upside. You don't want players that are good now necessarily, although if they're good now and they have upside, that's great, but they're probably gone by now. You want players that might, in a year or two, turn into something really good. If they don't have that upside, there is no point in drafting them. You only want guys who might be an absolute stud in a couple of years' time if you're doing a rebuild. If you're going young and strong, then realistically, you probably want some reliable players here. You've got a whole heap of young players. Your team's going to be pretty good. You want more good players here. Ideally, guys that are going into actual roles that give you a little bit of depth. I wouldn't mind a couple of veterans deep on my bench if I'm going young and strong, just to make sure that I have something reliable. But you could also look a little bit further ahead and try to pick up guys that you think in a couple of seasons' time are going to be pretty valuable for you. If you're aiming to win now, you just need to fill your bench with guys who are going to help you immediately or could help you immediately if things go their way. Regardless of the mode, your running backs should be handcuffed. They should be one injury away from being fantastic, or alternatively, they should be an every down back that just needs an opportunity. There is no point in drafting someone like a James White or something like that late on in drafts because they're never going to be a league winner for you. If you've already got your starters, there's no point in picking up those guys. So make sure that that player is an injury or a situation change away from being an every down star who's going to be fantastic for you. Someone like a Braylon Allen, a Tyler Algier, people like that are going to be extremely valuable, whereas guys like Jahmyr White, who last year with an injury still only turned into a running back 20-something, that's significantly less valuable. Obviously, he increases in value now because he's actually the starter. But if you're not the starter and you're just an early down back or just a change of pace back, suddenly your value is massively decreased. I'm thinking someone like a Keaton Mitchell, who's realistically never going to be an every down starter in the NFL. So there's no real reason to have him in your fantasy team. Your wide receivers also need to have upside. So even if they're the third wide receiver in their team, they need to be very good. They shouldn't be gadget players. They should be guys who are big enough to be used in the red zone that could be potentially used in an every down situation. You want upside. You want a potential star of the future. I also think that it's important to make sure that you have a bench tight end who's going to be useful in a bye week, and a different bench tight end with a heap of upside. So someone like a Trey McBride from last year would have been that upside player. We knew going into last year that McBride had a heap of upside, but he wasn't getting used. He suddenly gets a massive increase in value. The same, I this year would be thinking of guys like Jatavian Sanders, for example, who has a heap of upside, but he's probably not going to be good this year. He would be that sort of upside player that I'd be gunning for. Michael Mayer potentially probably is a trade away from being in a really good situation. He has a heap of upside. So we want those upside guys, but you also want that one bye week injury filler. That'd be someone like a Tyler Conklin or something, who realistically is pretty average. You can get him late in drafts. But if there's a bye week, you're fully comfortable starting him because he'll probably give you 7 to 10 points, something like that. In a 1 QB league, you really actually don't need that many quarterbacks because there's going to be quarterbacks on waivers. As long as you've got 2 solid quarterbacks who are going to be fantasy relevant and ideally top 12 to 15 quarterbacks, that's probably enough. It's okay to pick up an upside guy, but there's no point in picking up someone like a Michael Penix or a Bo Nix or something like that. Those guys lack the upside to really be stars if you already have established quarterbacks. Are they going to be better than Patrick Mahomes if you have Patrick Mahomes? No. So what's the point in having them on your roster? You don't need them. They're just wasting a roster spot that you could be using on a guy with more upside. You want guys who have a feasible track to being starters in your fantasy team. Also remember, when you're trading, when you're drafting, in everything you do, quality over quantity. There is no point in having 2 good players when you can have 1 great player. I would rather have 1 great player and nothing else, or 1 great player and a terrible player that I can get off waivers, rather than having 2 good players. Unless both of those good players have a lot of upside and have the potential to be better than the great player, I'd much rather have the great player. The great player can immediately go in and start, and I can make something happen in that other sport. I'd rather 1 player giving me 20 points than 2 players giving me 16 points, because I can find a player to give me 12 or more points, or I can take some risk and eventually track one down. Always go for great over good, quality over quantity. You don't want a whole heap of late picks in your dynasty startup. If you have the opportunity to trade away your late picks for high quality future draft picks, that's very useful. Even in win now mode, I would be trading away the last 5 or 6 rounds of a dynasty startup for 2nd or 3rd rounds in future drafts, especially 2nd rounders, because they're going to have significantly more value than late picks when I can just find someone else off waivers that's reasonably similar. Lastly, in the late round, never draft a DST or kicker until the last couple of rounds. There is no situation where that has good value. I don't care if 20 DSTs are off the board. There is no point in me drafting one until the late round. The only exception is if I'm in like a 32-team league. If I'm in a 32-team league, I need to take kickers because there's only going to be 32 of them and I need one of them. The other exception to that, of course, is if you need some DSTs because a lot of them are going off the board quickly, you might take one in the 3rd or 4th last round because you can see that people are starting to take their 2nd one. You want to make sure you've got one you're comfortable with if they're getting a big boost in scoring for some reason. For the most part, though, I take kicker in my last round, DST my 2nd last round, and I'll stream them for the next 5 years, and I don't care what's going on with everyone else. I want those guys that I'm going to use immediately in my wide receiver and running back spots. That's where the value is. Now, let's think about how we're going to actually value future rookie picks compared to startup picks. Now, this is the value of a rookie pick in this year's rookie draft. A lot of dynasty startups will have 1 draft for veterans and a separate draft for rookies. And there's a couple of reasons people do that. The first reason is that if you have, say, the 12th pick in your startup draft, then you get to have the 1st pick in the rookie draft, and that makes it a little bit more fair. And I can see an argument for that. The second reason is that some people just like to do an extra draft. They just enjoy having another draft to do, or they want to kind of get into the habit of having a rookie draft. I don't think this is necessary. Personally, I prefer to have just all players available in the same draft. But if you've got 2 drafts, that gives you the opportunity to trade around your picks and find value where it might not be there. So any sort of situation like this where people need to make decisions on the values of their picks, that can be a real opportunity for you if you have superior knowledge. I've gone through based on my rankings. This is how I compare rookie picks this year to startup picks in the future. Now, keep in mind, this is not true of future rookie picks. This is not for 2025. This will not be true in 2025 for the 2025 draft because those rookie picks are going to be valued differently. There are going to be different rookies who have different value. In this case, there are two elite rookies in Marvin Harrison Jr. and in Malik Neighbors. And they to me deserve to be in the first round of a startup. For that reason, I would value those first two rookie picks aligned with a late startup first round because that's when I'd be taking those guys anyway. It then filters down from there. Obviously, the next two guys, the guys like Brock Bowers and Rome Odunze, they to me belong in the third round of startup. So for that reason, I would be trading my rookie third or fourth overall picks for an early third rounder. That's kind of how you should be valuing these picks, thinking, when would this guy go if he was in the startup draft? Fine, I'll take my rookie draft pick and I'll value it that way. So hopefully that chart helps you out a little bit. Just remember, it's not true for 2025 and it's definitely not true for 2025 picks. Note that the late startup picks really decrease in value quite a lot. Everything really falls off after that. After about the 18th round, unless you're in a very deep league with a lot of starting players, those picks don't have much value to me because a rookie fourth round pick to me has next to no value either. I would ultimately take any of those picks after about the 18th round and trade it for a future second rounder or even an early third rounder. And I would be perfectly happy with that trade because I know I can get someone equivalently good off waivers. So think about that when you're trying to do drafts, and also when you're trying to trade draft picks. And if you have questions, of course, you're always welcome to hit me up. I'm happy to give you advice on your trades. Now, a couple of other things to consider just generally when you're trading picks. Firstly, there's a general time in the season when you should be trading picks away and trading for picks. Before the start of the season, that is to say in the preseason, after your rookie draft, you should not be trading for next year's draft picks because you don't know how valuable those draft picks are going to be and because you won't get to use them until after this season. So unless you're in a full rebuild, those picks have very little value for them. You get one less season of value from them than you do for whatever player or pick you're trading for them. So generally, I will trade away my future picks before the start of the season when people don't know that my team is actually quite good. And then I can trade for picks when the season finishes, or alternatively, if my team is looking pretty average halfway through the season. So I want to be thinking before the season starts in the preseason, try to trade for players that can help me win now, especially early on in the season as well. And then as the season goes on and the trade window is about to close, I think, am I legitimately actually going to win this season? If I'm not legitimately going to win this season, then I probably need to be trading away some players and trying to pick up some draft picks to make my team better for the future, or certainly trading away for younger players as well is also an option. As soon as my season finishes, the first moment I can to trade for picks, then I start trying to trade for picks. But before I do that, I need to understand the strength of the draft class. This year's draft class, which should be 2024, I wrote 2023. That's just me being a numpty. Sorry about that. 2024 draft pick is very strong in wide receiver and quarterback. So if I were if I was weak in wide receiver or quarterback, I would value this year's draft picks very highly. If I was desperate for a running back, I wouldn't trade, for 2024 picks because they're going to be useless for me. Jonathan Brooks is the best option and he's injured for the next while and everyone else is pretty average. I'd use my late picks on running backs, but realistically, I'm not gunning for those picks. If I really need a tight end, well, I'm going to need to find a way to get Brock Bowers. And if I can't get him, I'm not going to get another option in the draft either. So realistically, you need to understand what a draft class looks like. 2025 is going to be different. There are some good runners out of the 2025 draft. I think it's going to be a lot more balanced. Certainly the quarterbacks are going to be far weaker than this year's quarterback class. So if you need quarterbacks, this is the year to go out and get them as well. So it is important to understand what you need and how you should be valuing those picks. And you should be able to see that coming as far out as possible. It's also worth remembering that late round rookie picks, I'm thinking fourth round and onwards, unless you have a really deep league, they're pretty much useless they're not really worth very much. Every time you pick someone in the fourth, fifth, sixth round, if they're not better than the fourth worst player on your bench, you're going to ultimately drop them. So you need to either have four bad players on your bench, and why do you have four bad players on your bench in the first place? Or alternatively, you need to just get rid of those picks. They're very low value, and I love throwing them into deals because I don't value them at all. They're useless to me. I can get someone off waivers immediately after the draft that's going to be very similar to someone I pick up in the fourth round if I have so little depth. So think about that when you're valuing your future picks. Try to use your fourth rounders and even your third rounders as upgrades to help you get high value players in the first and second rounds with future picks. And you should be considering that when you're doing your dynasty startup. You only want to be trading for future picks if you're planning on a full rebuild now. Otherwise, trade them away and then you can look into getting them if your team's not actually as good as you thought it was going to be. So that's how I value picks. But it is worth keeping in mind that every situation is different. And if you got questions, make sure you hit me up. I'm happy to help you out with your trade questions. Let's go through a couple of examples. So I've been lucky enough to do a couple of mock drafts with the guys from CBS Sports on Fantasy Football Today. You can go check out those. I wasn't involved in the podcast or anything like that. I was just behind the scenes doing some drafting. I think it's just really good practice to draft against a whole heap of experts. So I did a couple of those. This is the more recent one. This is a 1 QB draft. I did it from the 11 spot. I went into this draft deciding I wanted to practice doing a win now draft. So basically, I decided I'm going to go for guys that are slightly older. I'm going to value older players a bit more than I usually would. And my goal is to draft a team that would be challenging for the next 2 to 3 years. I kind of gave myself a 2 to 3 year window and decided I was going to go for that win now approach. But I'd probably also pick up a couple of guys who could help me long term because ideally I want to make this into a bit more of a dynasty. So going into it, I started off with Malik Neighbors. In the 11th spot, that just felt like good value for me. I feel like even if your plan is to win now, if there's a wide receiver or a running back that's a rookie, they can help you win now as well. So Neighbors is someone that can be drafted in any approach. So I took Neighbors and I also took Keon Coleman later on when they were good value, simply because the value was there and I was confident they could help me win now. But I also drafted a whole heap of guys who are immediate win now guys. Taylor, Metcalf, White. You can see, especially when I'm getting guys like Amari Cooper, Devin Singletary, Njoku, Chubb. These are all aging guys who are going to be able to help me immediately and can help me win straight away. Even in this situation where I'm trying to win now, I don't want players who are falling off. I don't want Stephon Diggs. I don't want Cooper Kupp because they're not going to help me at all, ever. They're not only not going to help me this year, they're not going to help me into the future as well. So you can see there's a pretty nice mix there, but the focus is on players who can help me win now, even if they're young and helping me win now. You can also see that that's the focus of my bench. Because I'm trying to win now, I've already got my starting running backs. I don't really need upside guys on my bench because I know I have Taylor, I know I have White, I know I have Singletary. They're all likely to start and be reliable options. I've also got the upside of Chubb, and I think that Rico Dowdle's probably a starter. So in those last few rounds, I went for wide receivers who are going to be useful straight away. Tyler Lockett's probably still a top 24 wide receiver. Because I'm already weak at wide receiver, because I've taken some slightly younger guys who might not hit immediately and I want to win in this first season, I've brought in some guys who can help me win now if things go the right way. Lockett could still be useful. Mike Williams, if he's healthy, is going to be helpful straight away. Josh Palmer could potentially have that top role. There's upside there, and they're potentially going to be useful. You can also see that I waited a long time on quarterback because I'm trying to win now, so I don't value that long-term value of a quarterback as much. I picked up Jaden Daniels because I think he's actually going to run a lot this season, and he's actually technically a win now option. Plus, this gives me the option to rebuild in a couple of seasons' time. But I really got a whole heap of value in getting Trevor Lawrence later on. He was about the 18th or 19th quarterback off the board. There were about 2 or 3 quarterbacks I knew were useful. I waited until he was the last one left, and then I took him. That's excellent value, and that means that I'm definitely going to have a quarterback who can help me win, even if Daniels doesn't work out. Contrast that draft with this one here. This is a super flex draft, which obviously changes the value of quarterbacks, but I went into it unsure of what I was going to do. This is the first of the 2 drafts I did. And I found that Caleb Williams dropped to me. I think that 8th off the board is the 8th quarterback. That's great value. I have him as my 6th quarterback. He went after guys like Kyler Murray, which I think is kind of crazy. And then Jaden Daniels fell to me in the second round. It wasn't necessarily my intention to go young, but as soon as I saw those two guys fall, I realized that I had a real opportunity to draft a good young team. In the third round, I then saw Malik Neighbors fall. He was about the 14th or 15th wide receiver off the board, which was fantastic value because he's my sixth. And as soon as I'd done that, I kind of started to feel like I was a good chance of having a good young team. Then I didn't have the quality players fall to me. I realized I need to take guys like Adunze and Bowers, who probably aren't going to be fantastic straight out of the gate, might need a little bit of time to rebuild, but I still wasn't sure exactly what the team was going to look like. And I realized I had no running backs. So I took Pacheco, and that was a mistake. Because at that point, I probably should have realized I was in a rebuild and I didn't fully commit to it. And that's the kind of mistake you can easily make. Pacheco was fantastic value there. For me, he's top 12 running back in Dynasty, and I was getting him as the 16th or 17th running back off the board. But there was no need for me to go running back at all. I can take a running back later on. Heck, I got Ramondre Stevenson in like the 10th round. If I wanted someone, that was always an option. I think he's still going to be good for another 3 or 4 or 5 years. He just signed a long contract. So I can take running backs later on and still get viable starters. There was no need to take one there. If anything, I would have preferred this draft a lot if I hadn't taken Pacheco, Stevenson, or Gus Edwards, and I just avoided running back altogether and taken them very late on. You can see I'm getting guys like Davis and Dowdle late on. There are a whole heap of other guys like Braylon Allen I could have taken, and I just don't try to win this first year at all. Most of my players are rookies. I took nearly more rookies than I did other players. TJ Hawkinson goes into that rebuild slot because he's not going to play most of this season, but he's still a good asset I can then sell once he's healthy. So the biggest mistake I made there was taking running backs early and also taking Russell Wilson because I didn't get a third quarterback. So it's really important when you do these things to understand that you've got to commit to your strategy, and I didn't go 100% commit. And this is the kind of mistake you can do. It's also what happens when you try to do a draft at 2 a.m. in the morning. So there's a couple of examples. You can see the difference between what I've done there in the types of players I'm getting and what I'm aiming to do. But it really was decided 4 or 5 picks in what both drafts, what I was going to do. But I equally could have gone into the draft deciding I was going to do it that way. I just limit how much value I can be when I go in with a set approach. Last thing I want to talk about is your league settings. Every league is set up differently. No matter what league you're in, it's going to be different to everyone else's. And that makes it really hard for those of us who are trying to make rankings for you. When I do my rankings, it's tough just to rank within a given position because I don't know how much you're trying to win now, what your goal is with your league. Do you want to win straight away? And therefore, someone like an Amari Cooper and a Mike Evans is very valuable. Or are you thinking 2 or 3 years down the road, in which case someone like Jonathan Brooks becomes massively valuable because he's probably going to be very good in 3 years, even if he's not straight away. TJ Hawkinson gets a jump in that case as well. So certain players are going to be valuable based on your situation. Plus, what are your league settings? Is it PPR? Do you have tight end premium? What's your bench look like? Do you start 2 flex spots? How should I value wide receivers to running backs? They're all difficult questions, and you saw all those things that we talked about today. For that reason, every set of rankings you find on the internet is going to be wrong for your league. They're all going to be wrong for your league because they're set up for a certain situation, and that's not your situation. Luckily, this is something I can help with. What I've been doing for the last few years is very simple. I will sell you personalized rankings, and I'll do it pretty cheap. I've got an algorithm that will calculate it for your league settings and tell you what you should expect from those players moving forward and how you should value those players. It works out pretty well. I've had some really good feedback from it. If you're interested in this, you just got to email me, benwasley23@gmail.com. If your league has very complicated settings or something really funky, especially if it's got keepers and things like that, I can definitely help you out with that. It's just going to cost a little bit more. $10 is basically just for, I take your settings, I slot them in, I work out what rankings work for those settings. It does take me a fair amount of time because I want you guys to win your leagues. I can also charge a little bit more and give you extra help during the season or during the draft, and I can even draft with you. So if you need help for your drafts, I'm happy to help you, and here's a special offer to get you started. Please make sure you consider that if you have a Dynasty startup or even want your redraft league startup as well. I'll be happy to be involved with that stuff for you. And that's all we've got for today. To wrap things up, just a reminder, please make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. It really helps us grow as a channel, helps me have the ability to keep on doing these videos for you and taking the time to put them together properly and making sure I get them out every few days. Make sure you follow us on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. That's where I put all my rankings first. You can also check us out on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. You can also DM me on either of those apps. I'll answer your draft questions and your trade questions, and I can also help you out with those personal rankings over there as well. Our website is ffdfantasyfootball.com. I've got dynasty rankings on there, and I've also got IDP rankings that I've put up recently on there as well. So make sure you check out the site. There's also a list of a whole heap of videos I've done for other sites to do some stuff for Razzball. I guest on walterfootball.com. So there's quite a few other podcasts that I go on there as well. And you can also check out all my articles there that I write for a number of sites. Most of my work I do is for Razzball, though. They do some fantastic stuff over there. They've got a heap of applets and things like that that can help you understand how to value certain players, look at how players are being used during the season, help you with your waiver wire apps. I know I work for them, but I use their stuff constantly to help me with my ranking. So make sure you head over to football.razzball.com. You can see a heap of my articles and you can get a heap of help there as well. I talk through my dynasty rankings a lot there as well. So that's definitely worth checking out too. And finally, I look forward to seeing you on the next video. Hope you have an awesome day.